The tray shook in my hands before the doors even opened, and I told myself it was the ventilation system and not fear, though I already knew that was a lie. My name is Adaizi Obi, and 11 minutes earlier, I had been the least important soldier in an empire of 400 trillion people. Now I stood outside a sealed door on the lowest level of the palace, holding a meal for something that had not been fed by a living hand in 3,821 years. The officer who gave me the tray would not look at me directly. He kept his eyes on the wall behind my shoulder as he spoke. "You walk in," he said. "You set the tray down. You walk out. Do not speak to it. Do not meet its eyes. Do not turn your back until the door is sealed again." I asked him why nobody had fed it by hand in so long. He did not answer. He just handed me a key card and walked away faster than a man his age should have been able to walk. The corridor down to that cell was colder than any place I had stood before, and it was not the kind of cold that comes from broken heating. It was the kind of cold that settles into stone after that stone has watched too many things happen and refused to forget any of them. A guard stood near the final checkpoint, tall and armored, with 4 narrow eyes that tracked the tray in my hands, like it was the last object he expected to see moving in that hallway. He did not speak to me either. He simply stepped aside. The door to the cell was thick metal, with a small viewport at eye level. I should not have looked through it. I looked through it anyway. 2 eyes stared back at me from the darkness, gold and enormous, with pupils like narrow blades. Behind them, something vast shifted in the shadows, muscle and fur rolling like a small mountain deciding whether to wake up. It was shaped like a cat. It was built like a disaster. I whispered to myself that it was only feeding time, nothing more, and then I pressed my palm against the scanner, and the door slid open with a sound like a held breath finally released. The smell hit me first, dust and metal, and something warmer underneath it, like old spice from a kitchen I used to know as a child. I crossed the cell floor, and every step felt longer than the one before it. I placed the tray on a stone shelf that had clearly been built for this exact purpose long ago, by someone who never returned to use it again. I straightened my back and did not run. I want that remembered, because everything in my body was screaming at me to run. "That is not a fancy meal," I said, because silence felt more dangerous than speaking. "Protein paste, and some kind of fish substitute. If you have complaints, I recommend the kitchen staff, though I suspect they are more afraid of you than I am." The eyes narrowed, not with anger, but with something closer to confusion. "You are speaking to me," said a voice, though its mouth never moved. The sound did not arrive through my ears. It arrived somewhere behind my chest, low and slow, like a bell struck from very far away. "They told me not to," I admitted, "but nobody warned me you would answer, so I think the rule broke itself." There was a long pause before it spoke again. "No one has spoken to me since the guards who buried the guards, who buried the ones who first locked this door," it said. 3,821 years, small human, and you are worried about the kitchen staff. In my defense, I said, everyone worries about something. Yours is simply larger than mine. It rose then, fully, and I understood that what I had seen curled in the dark was only a small part of it. My legs wanted to carry me backward, but I forced myself to stay still. "Why did the throne send you?" it asked. "I have faced generals. I have faced kings. 3 different rulers tried to end me, and I still remain, while their armies became old memories. Why send a soldier who does not even command a full unit?" "I do not know the full reason," I said honestly, "but I have a guess. Every people who ruled this empire before mine sent their finest warriors, their wisest leaders, their strongest fighters, and every one of them either failed or gave up and left you to machines instead. Maybe the ruler decided it was time to send someone who was not important enough to be afraid of you out of pride, just someone ordinary." Something shifted behind those huge golden eyes, something that looked almost like surprise. "You are frightened," it said. "I can sense it. Your heart beats like a war drum inside your chest. I am terrified, I answered, because there was no use pretending otherwise. I have been terrified since the doors opened. But being afraid and being respectful are not opposites. My grandmother taught me that fear should never make a person rude inside someone else's home. This cell is your home. I am only a visitor, carrying dinner. Two things happening at once, which feels very human of me. For the first time in over 3,000 years, that stone room heard something like laughter, deep and rolling, like far-off thunder finally breaking after a long dry season. Dust fell from the ceiling, disturbed for the first time since the guards who built this place had turned to memory themselves. "Come again tomorrow, small human," it said, settling back into its coiled shape, one massive paw resting near the edge of the tray, as though it did not want the meal, or perhaps the company, to leave too quickly. "Bring the same meal. I find I do not mind your presence as much as I expected to." I did return the next day, and the day after that. Each time, I walked the same corridor, past the same silent guard, through the same heavy door, and each time it grew a little less like walking toward danger, and a little more like walking toward something waiting for me. On the 7th visit it told me its name, though the sound it made could not be spoken by a human throat, so I gave it a shorter name instead, one it seemed to accept without complaint. I called it Kestrel, because the old records described its people as sky hunters before their world was lost. Kestrel told me about a home that no longer existed, about skies filled with creatures larger than any ship I had ever flown in, about a war that had reduced an entire civilization down to one prisoner and one empty cell. I listened without interrupting, because some stories only need a listener, not a judge. On the 14th visit, an alarm sounded through the lower levels while I stood inside the cell. Red light filled the corridor outside, and the heavy door began sliding shut on its own, sealing the room. I turned toward the exit out of pure instinct, but Kestrel moved faster than I believed possible, placing itself between me and the closing door. "Stay behind me," it said, its voice suddenly sharp instead of slow. "Something has entered the lower levels that should not be here." Through the small viewport, I could see shapes moving in the corridor, armored figures that did not belong to the palace guard, their weapons raised toward anything that moved. Kestrel pressed one massive paw against the door controls, and though the door did not fully open, a narrow gap appeared, enough for something enormous and clawed to pass through, though not enough for me to follow. Kestrel disappeared into that corridor, and for several long minutes I heard sounds I will not describe in detail, because some sounds are better left as memory rather than retold as entertainment. When the door finally opened fully again, Kestrel stood alone in a corridor that had gone completely silent, and the intruders were no longer a threat to anyone. "You protected me," I said, once I found my voice again. "You brought me food when no one else would," it answered. "You spoke to me when no one else dared. In 3,000 years, small human, you are the only visitor who ever treated this cell like a home instead of a cage. I decided a long time ago that I would not let harm reach the one person who remembered I was more than a weapon locked away." News of that night reached the highest levels of the palace within hours. The following morning, I was summoned to a private meeting, not with a low-ranking officer this time, but with the ruler of the empire himself. He did not ask why the creature had defended me. He asked what I had done differently from every general, every diplomat, and every scholar who had approached that cell before me across nearly 4,000 years. I gave him the same answer I gave the guard on the very first day. I told him I had simply spoken to it as though it deserved conversation, rather than approaching it as though it deserved only fear and control. The ruler was quiet for a long moment before he spoke again. He told me that from that day forward, I would hold a new position within the palace, one that had never existed before, keeper of the lower cell, and the first human ever given full authority over what the empire had once considered its most dangerous prisoner. I did not do anything remarkable to earn that position. I brought a simple meal, I said a simple greeting. I treated 3,821 years of loneliness as something worth acknowledging, instead of something to be managed from behind thick metal doors and silent machines. It turns out that simple kindness, offered without hesitation, can succeed where every army, every strategy, and every generation of fear had failed before it. And somewhere beneath the palace, in a cell that finally felt less like a prison and more like a home, Kestrel waits each evening, not for food alone, but for the sound of familiar footsteps in the corridor outside its door.